The Lazy Trio! Raiding. It's one of the main reasons people play World of Warcraft, and throughout the past 10 years we've seen some truly amazing raids. In this video we're going to count the top 10 WoW raids as voted by you, the community. For the most part I agree with the raids that made this list, although some scored much higher than I expected. Number 10. Throne of Thunder. Throne of Thunder was a linear raid added to the game in patch 5.2, the Thunder King. The raid's located on the Isle of Thunder in Pandaria and has a mysterious Mogu Zandalari themed aesthetic. Despite the linearity of the raid, it was really well received by most of the community due to the variety of environments, pacing and diverse boss mechanics. Throne of Thunder is also home to the most infamous raid trash in the game, known by some as Gary the Snail. This slimy gastropod would one-shot anyone that got too close, and is responsible for more kills than any of the bosses in LFR. My personal favourite Throne of Thunder encounter was Lei Shen, which aesthetically was the most impressive fight in the tier for me, and the room you got to fight him in feels really epic. Overall, Throne of Thunder was a solid raid tier, one with plenty of variety and interesting boss mechanics. Number 9. BLACKROCK Foundry. BLACKROCK Foundry was released at the end of patch 6.0 as the second part of the first raid tier in Warlords of Draenor. Initially the raid was considered by many as one of the hardest in a long time and was very tightly tuned. It took Method 10 days to down the final boss on Mythic, and a further 5 days before Paragon became the second guild to clear the raid. After that only a few guilds actually cleared the place before Blizzard gave players a large boost to their power by upping the item levels dropped by BRF bosses, making it slightly easier. From a mechanics point of view, I really enjoyed some of the bosses in Foundry such as Kromog, Hans and Franz and Operator Thogar, as they're very high mobility encounters which I personally enjoy. One criticism I do have for the raid however is visually there's not much diversity, and shortly after the 14 months of Siege of Orgrimmar, the last thing I want to do is fight more orcs, but that's just me. As a raid it's really good and the Black Hand fight is said to have been one of the hardest ever designed. Number 8. The Sunwell. This was a raid brought into the game in patch 2.4, the final patch of the Burning Crusade, and was said to have been one of the hardest raids ever made, breaking many guilds and only being seen by a very small percentage of the player base. Back in BC, gearing up was very different to how it is today. There was no LFR or group finder, and if you wanted to progress you'd have to join a guild. First you'd start gearing from heroics and rep rewards, then you'd go to KARAZHAN, Gruul's Lair, Megtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep, Hyjal, Black Temple and finally the Sunwell. I think a big reason very few players got to see this raid was also due to the lack of catch-up mechanics back then, which I personally preferred as it put you on a journey and didn't make previous raids or dungeons feel irrelevant. The fact that not many players got to see the Sunwell for me isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it constantly gave players something to shoot for rather than clearing the place on easy mode within the space of hours. Aesthetically, the Sunwell's a really beautiful raid and has a lot of Blood Elf architecture. It's based on the Isle of Quel'Danas, which is also one of the more popular max level daily questing hubs. The Sunwell for me will always be remembered as the raid where we took down Kil'jaeden, one of the biggest and baddest lore villains in the Warcraft universe. I just wish I had the chance to do it whilst it was current content. Maybe if Blizzard implement the scaled legacy raids, we'll get to experience the awesomeness of this raid once again. Number 7. The Firelands. I was actually surprised to see how high this one scored, as the community seemed to have very mixed opinions on this raid, either really enjoying it or hating it. The Firelands was added to the game in patch 4.2, giving players the opportunity to visit the elemental plane of fire and once again take down Ragnaros, which appealed to players like me that never got to kill him in vanilla. Aesthetically, the Firelands has a lot of fire and lava, which you'd expect from this raid, however it does give you a bit of visual burnout after a while due to the lack of environmental diversity. Initially the Firelands patch was also supposed to include the Abyssal Moor raid, which is the complete opposite of the Firelands, based in the elemental plane of water. This however was scrapped by Blizzard, which is a shame, as I think more people would have enjoyed this patch if it had more artistic diversity in the raids. For me personally, I like the Firelands for the interesting boss mechanics, amazing armor sets that came with the tier, and the massive sense of scale you get when you walk in for the first time. I love it when Blizzard design outside raids rather than being stuck in a room. The non-linear aspect of the Firelands was also really nice. Overall I think it's a decent raid, worthy of a spot on this list. Number 6. The Black Temple. Patch 2.1 brought the release of the Black Temple, giving players the chance to take down Illidan's Stormrage, a major lore character and badass throughout the history of Warcraft. The Black Temple was huge in terms of size and scale. I love how you'd enter through the sewers and eventually fight your way right to the top with the help of a Karma. There's also plenty of diversity in the environment, and the raid had an overall epic feel to it. In terms of lore, the Black Temple used to be the Temple of Karabor, a sacred place which served as a refuge for the Draenei until Gul'dan ordered for the temple to be taken over and turned into the headquarters for the Shadow Council. As a raid, many people still return to the Black Temple today for transmog farming, as Tier 6 featured some really nice sets. One of the most awe-inspiring and well-known weapons in the game can also be acquired here, the Warglaives of Azzinoth, which drops from Illidan himself. I've personally farmed the Black Temple many times in hope of getting a Warglaive, but I'm yet to have any luck. Overall, the Black Temple was an epic raid with a tense atmospheric soundtrack, huge sense of scale, and the perfect stage to fight one of the most badass characters in the history of Warcraft. Number 5, the Siege of Orgrimmar. This was another raid that I didn't expect to receive as many votes as it did, due to it being a ridiculously long 14-month raid tier, the largest gap in content since the game was released, but judging it by the quality of the raid and not how long it lasted, it's easy to see why many people enjoyed it. The Siege of Orgrimmar was a totally linear raid with a diverse aesthetic, with players starting in Pandaria, eventually storming the beach in Durotar, fighting their way through the Horde's capital city, eventually fighting Garrosh Hellscream beneath Orgrimmar. From start to finish, it was an extremely long 14 boss raid tier that took quite some time to fully clear. I personally enjoyed many of the fights in this raid, my favourites being Blackfuse and Garrosh himself, as they had a decent amount of personal responsibility and challenge involved. The Siege of Orgrimmar cinematic was actually the thing that got me back into the World of Warcraft after taking a break at the start of Mists. I just thought the idea of raiding Orgrimmar was really cool, and I think that's the reason many people voted for this raid. Overall, Siege of Orgrimmar was a really good raid that just lasted way too long. It had some interesting mechanics, a unique aesthetic, and offered a decent amount of challenge above LFR difficulty. Number 4, Naxxramas. Naxx was originally added to the game in Vanilla's patch 1.1 and was only seen by around 1% of the player base, with even less people actually clearing it. Naxx 40 was and still is considered one of the hardest raids ever to exist in the World of Warcraft, and gearing up to even take a look inside would take months of farming on its own. The original Naxx was removed for the launch of Wrath of the Lich King and remade into a level 80 raid, which wasn't as hard as the original for a few reasons. The first and most obvious being that coordinating a group of 10 to 25 players is much easier than doing it for 40 players. Classes had new abilities and went through rebalancing, which made it easier to deal with mechanics, and finally the challenge of actually finding geared players was less of an issue. For example, in Naxx 40 for the 4 Horsemen, you needed 8 geared tanks with the 4 set piece bonus so taunts wouldn't miss. I'm really glad they added Naxx into Wrath of the Lich King, as it was the first raid I ever got to see as a new player. I remember loving the winged layout, which gave you a bunch of options if you got stuck on a boss. It wasn't too challenging either, especially on 10 player mode, and the whole aesthetic of the place suited the Wrath of the Lich King expansion perfectly. Overall, Naxxramas is one of my personal favourites, and I'll always remember it as my first real raiding experience. The winged layout was great, the bosses were cool, and it served as the perfect launch raid for Wrath of the Lich King. Number 3, KARAZHAN. This was one of the Burning Crusade's launch raids, and for many players this was their first raiding experience, giving them a taste of what real raiding was actually like. The cool thing about KARAZHAN is that it's a castle styled raid, and almost feels like a maze when you go there for the first time. It's full of mystery, and making your way to the top of the tower, not knowing what's in each of the rooms, is a lot of fun. To enter KARAZHAN back in the day, you needed to be attuned and have the Master's Key, which is acquired from a quest chain. Personally, I wish they'd bring back achievements into the game, as it felt like you were going on a journey, and for many players in BC, KARAZHAN was just the start of that journey due to how gearing worked back then. In terms of lore, KARAZHAN's the Tower of Medivh, the last guardian of Tirisfal. However, once killed by Khadgar, Lothar and Garona, the tower sealed itself off from the rest of the world, eventually being reawoken years later after Medivh's death by an evil presence. Personally, I love the whole atmosphere and theme throughout KARAZHAN, and in comparison to other raids it doesn't feel as serious, which is a nice change. I really hope Blizzard do something with KARAZHAN again in the future, or even let us experience it again as a scaled legacy raid. Overall, KARAZHAN's definitely worthy of a spot on this list, and it's not hard to see why it gets so much love from the community. It was a unique, mysterious and fun raid that made new raiders want to progress further. Number 2, ULDUAR. Located in the Storm Peaks, ULDUAR was released in patch 3.1 as the second tier in Wrath of the Lich King. This is a raid I have very fond memories of, as someone that hit level cap for the first time in Wrath. ULDUAR was the second raid I got to experience after Naxxramas, and what an incredible experience it was. I remember the first time I set foot in ULDUAR, the scale of the place was huge, and the first fight being in vehicles was something I'd never seen before. After you killed Flame Leviathan, you had choices as to what boss you killed next: Razor Scale, the Furnace Master or XT. Downing XT would open up more options, the Iron Council or Kolaghan, and from there you'd fight each of the Titanic Watchers in an order of your choice to open up the path to Yogg-Saron's prison. Aesthetically, ULDUAR is my favourite raid. The sheer size of the place allowed Blizzard to create some really diverse environments. You have the icy themed area with Hodir, the forest theme with Freya, the mechanical area with Mimron, and the gladiator theme with Thorin. This made each fight feel totally different, and exploring this place for the first time was so much fun. The final boss, Yogg-Saron, is also a fight to remember, and can still kill you today if you don't understand the mechanics. For me, this fight was really unique and remains as one of my favourites to this day. The final thing I want to mention is how awesome the Tier 8 armour sets were. They are by far my favourite sets that Blizzard have designed, and they give me a reason to go back for transmog runs. Overall, ULDUAR is my personal favourite raid. It had everything: cool boss fights, a sense of scale and epicness, great looking tier sets, an awesome non-linear layout, and an interesting theme throughout the raid. Number 1. Icecrown Citadel. It's no surprise to me that ICC was voted as the best raid in WoW. Fighting Arthas was something we all knew was coming, and it was this fight which the entire expansion was building up to. Prior to the release of the raid, Blizzard built a lot of hype for patch 3.3 by having Arthas pop up throughout the questing experience, giving hints about his past via quests, and finally the Wrathgate cinematic, which has got to be one of the most memorable and epic cinematics in the game. Like many of the Lich King raids, ICC was winged and gave you options as to what order you can kill the bosses in, which is always nice as it means you can just go to another boss if you're struggling. Aesthetically, ICC is a huge tower in which you fight your way to the top to find Arthas. It has a very cold, intense feel to the place, which helps set the stage for the Lich King fight. The Lich King Heroic was considered by many as one of the hardest fights in the game, with only one guild, Paragon, managing to beat it before the nerf. I think a big part of the reason that ICC is the most popular WoW raid is because we finally got to take down the most well-known lore villain in the game, whose story went all the way back to Warcraft 3, where he started out as a good guy, eventually falling to the corruption of Frostmourne. Personally, the Arthas storyline is my favourite and is clearly a community favourite too. Overall, ICC was an amazing raid, one with an incredible build-up, and it's more than worthy of being the best raid in WoW. So that's it for this video, guys. If you agree with this list or want to tell me your own personal top 10 raids, then let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.